The gavel had been falling steadily for 3 hours at the Millbrook County Livestock Auction, each strike marking another transaction in the endless cycle of commerce. Auctioneer Hollis Carmichael's voice had grown hoarse from the rapid fire, bidding calls, but his rhythm never faltered, until the barn door creaked open and every head turned toward the figure silhouetted against the afternoon sun. The man who entered looked like he'd been carved from weathered oak and forgotten in a field. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, patched and repatched until the original fabric was anyone's guess. Mud caked his worn boots, and his hat had seen better decades. But it wasn't his appearance that made Hollis's voice catch mid-sentence. It was the way the chestnut mare in the ring suddenly lifted her head, ears swiveling forward like radar dishes locking onto a signal. Now, as I was saying, Hollis attempted to continue, but the words died in his throat. The entire auction house had fallen into an unnatural quiet, the kind that settles over a crowd when something extraordinary is about to happen. The ragged farmer, Quentin Brashear, though few present knew his name, stood frozen just inside the doorway. His eyes, the color of storm clouds, fixed on the horse with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. The mare, a beautiful creature with a coat like burnished copper, took a tentative step toward the rail that separated the bidding floor from the auction ring. Hollis had been selling livestock for 37 years, and he'd never seen anything quite like this. Horses were practical animals, responding to familiar voices and trusted hands. But this mare, Belle, according to her paperwork, was acting as if she'd just heard her name called by someone she'd been waiting for her entire life. The crowd began to murmur, a low rustle of whispered conversations and shifting bodies. Wealthy buyers in pressed shirts and polished boots craned their necks to get a better look at the newcomer. Local farmers, recognizing one of their own despite his desperate circumstances, felt their hearts sink a little lower. Everyone could see what was happening, even if they couldn't quite believe it. Quentin took a halting step forward, his calloused hands trembling at his sides. He'd walked 12 miles to get here, knowing he had no money to bid, knowing he could only watch as his life's work was parceled out to strangers. The bank had taken everything, his land, his equipment, his future. Everything except the memories of the horses he'd raised from foals, trained with infinite patience, and loved like children. Belle whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry decades of longing. Her dark eyes never left Quentin's face, and, for a moment, the packed auction house might as well have been empty. It was just a broken man and the horse he'd raised from birth, separated by circumstance, but connected by something deeper than ownership. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. Someone coughed. A child whispered a question to his mother, but still, Hollis couldn't bring himself to resume the bidding. Some moments, he realized, were too sacred to interrupt with the crude arithmetic of commerce. Finally, Belle moved. She walked to the edge of the ring closest to Quentin and pressed her muzzle against the rail, stretching as far as the confined space would allow. Her neck extended toward the man who had taught her to trust human hands, who had whispered to her in the dark during difficult births, who had never raised his voice even when she'd tested his patience as a spirited yearling. Hollis Carmichael had witnessed thousands of auctions, but he'd never felt the weight of collective breath being held until this moment. The entire crowd seemed suspended in time, watching the wordless conversation between the ragged farmer and the chestnut mare. Even the most hardened cattle buyers, men who viewed livestock as nothing more than walking profit margins, found themselves leaning forward in their seats. Quentin's weathered face crumpled as Belle extended her neck toward him, her soft muzzle nearly touching his outstretched fingers across the rail. 23 years ago, he'd delivered this mare on a stormy night when her mother struggled with a difficult birth. He'd stayed awake for 3 days straight, bottle-feeding her when The mare rejected her foal, teaching her to walk on unsteady legs, whispering promises about the life they'd build together. "That there's Quentin Brass here," whispered old Morton Keller to his neighbor, his voice barely audible above the electric silence. "Raised that horse from a baby. Bank took his place last month." The whisper carried, as such whispers do, in small communities, spreading through the crowd like ripples across still water. Soon, half the auction house knew the story. How Quentin had spent 4 decades building one of the finest horse operations in 3 counties. How a combination of drought, falling prices, and his wife's cancer treatments had slowly bled him dry. How he'd sold everything he could before the bank claimed the rest. Millicent Hayes, who owned the largest ranch in the county, felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't experienced in years. She'd built her empire through shrewd dealing and calculated risks, never allowing sentiment to cloud her judgment. But watching Quentin's trembling hand nearly touch Belle's nose across that impossible distance, she found her own eyes growing damp. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hollis finally managed, his usually confident voice cracking like thin ice, "we have here a 7-year-old mare, excellent bloodlines, trained for both riding and light draft work. Shall we start the bidding at $500? The silence that followed was deafening. In a room full of people who'd come specifically to buy horses, no one raised their hand. They all understood, with the intuitive wisdom that sometimes emerges in crowds, that they were witnessing something that transcended mere commerce. Belle pawed at the ground, her hooves striking the packed earth with increasing urgency. She'd been confused and frightened when strangers loaded her into a trailer that morning, separated from the only home she'd ever known. But now, seeing Quentin's familiar face, she wanted nothing more than to bridge the gap between them. 500? Hollis tried again, though his heart wasn't in it. "Come now, this is a quality animal with impeccable training." A young cowboy near the back raised his hand tentatively, then immediately lowered it when the person next to him elbowed him sharply in the ribs. The gesture rippled through the crowd. This wasn't the time for ordinary business. Something larger was happening here, something that demanded respect rather than participation. Quentin closed his eyes, pressing his forehead against the rail. He'd known this day would come, had spent weeks preparing himself for the moment when he'd watch his life's work sold to strangers. But seeing Belle's recognition, feeling her desperate desire to come home, was more than his broken heart could bear. "I'm sorry, girl," he whispered, his voice so soft that only those in the front rows could hear. "I'm so damn sorry." Belle heard him, though. She always had possessed an almost supernatural ability to understand his moods, to sense his intentions, before he'd fully formed them himself. Now, she began to pace the small confines of the auction ring, her distress becoming more evident with each circuit. The crowd watched in fascination and growing discomfort as the mare's agitation increased. This wasn't just a horse missing her owner. This was a creature experiencing genuine grief, and everyone present could feel the raw emotion radiating from the ring like heat from a forge. In the third row, Cordelia Vance shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She'd driven 4 hours from Louisville specifically to buy Belle, having studied the auction catalog and identified the mare as perfect for her daughter's competitive riding aspirations. Cordelia had the money, more than enough to outbid anyone, in this rural auction house. But watching Quentin's obvious anguish made her feel like a vulture circling fresh carrion. "Mom, we should just go," her 16-year-old daughter Paisley whispered, tugging at her mother's sleeve. "This feels wrong." Cordelia had built her family's wealth through real estate development, approaching every transaction with clinical detachment. Sentiment was a luxury she'd never been able to afford during her climb from poverty to prosperity. Yet something about this scene was penetrating her carefully constructed emotional armor. Near the front, Boone McAllister scratched his grizzled chin and studied the situation with the calculating eye of a man who'd spent 60 years in the horse business. He'd intended to bid on Belle for his grandson, but the boy was off at college and wouldn't be back until Christmas. Surely he could wait for another horse, another auction. The mare continued her restless pacing, occasionally stopping to stare at Quentin with such intensity that it made several observers shift uncomfortably. Animals weren't supposed to display such complex emotions, such obvious longing. It challenged the comfortable distance most people maintained between themselves and the creatures they used for work, sport, or profit. "Hollis!" called out a voice from the middle of the crowd. It belonged to Jasper Thornfield, a cattle rancher known more for his pragmatism than his sentiment. "Maybe we ought to take a break. Let folks collect themselves." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. This had moved beyond uncomfortable into something approaching sacred, and the crowd's collective wisdom recognized that some moments required pause rather than progress. But Hollis, despite his obvious emotional investment in the scene, had a job to do. The auction house took a percentage of every sale, and bills didn't pay themselves out of respect for touching reunions. "I appreciate the suggestion, folks, but we've got a full catalog to get through today. Now, shall we resume? $500 to start?" This time the silence had a different quality, not just respectful but defiant. It was as if the entire crowd had silently agreed to passive resistance, to protect something precious through collective inaction. Quentin straightened slowly, his weathered hands gripping the rail until his knuckles went white. He'd spent the morning steeling himself for this moment, but actually seeing Belle's distress was unbearable. He'd raised her to trust humans, to expect kindness and consistency. Now she was experiencing her first real betrayal, and he was the cause. "Excuse me," said a clear voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see a young woman standing up, her long auburn hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the barn windows. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a flannel shirt, but carried herself with quiet confidence. "Yes, miss?" Hollis responded, grateful for any interruption that might break the emotional deadlock. "My name is Rowan Fitzgerald," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent auction house. "I'm a veterinarian from the next county over, and I couldn't help but notice the mare's obvious distress. Would it be possible to postpone this particular lot until we can ensure the animal's well-being?" It was a clever intervention, using professional concern as a justification for delay. Several people nodded approvingly, recognizing the diplomatic nature of her suggestion. But before Hollis could respond, Belle solved the problem herself. With a sudden burst of energy born from desperation, she gathered herself and leaped over the 4-foot rail separating the auction ring from the crowd. The crack of Belle's hooves hitting the concrete floor echoed through the auction house like gunshots, followed immediately by screams and the scraping of chairs as people scrambled to get out of the way. A 1,200-pound mare loose in a crowded building was every auction house's nightmare scenario, but Belle seemed to have only one destination in mind. She moved through the panicking crowd with surprising grace, her training evident in how she avoided trampling anyone despite the chaos surrounding her. Her entire focus remained fixed on Quentin, who stood frozen at the rail, torn between joy at seeing her coming toward him and terror that someone might be hurt. "Easy, girl," he called softly, extending his hand toward her as she approached. "Easy now." Belle slowed as she reached him, her breathing heavy from the exertion and excitement. She pressed her face against his chest, and Quentin wrapped his arms around her neck, 23 years of partnership flooding back in an instant. The familiar scent of her coat, the warmth of her breath against his cheek, the solid reality of her presence. It was like finding a piece of his soul he'd thought lost forever. The crowd slowly settled, realizing that the escaped horse posed no danger. Indeed, Belle seemed calmer now than she had all day, standing quietly beside the man who'd raised her, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder with the familiarity of old habits. "Well," Hollis said, his voice shaky with a mixture of professional embarrassment and personal amazement, "this is a first." Several people chuckled nervously, the tension beginning to ease. But the fundamental problem remained. Belle was still consigned to the auction, regardless of her dramatic gesture of preference. "Folks," Quentin said, his voice carrying across the quiet room, "I want to apologize for this disruption. Belle here, she's always been spirited, but she's a good horse, the best I ever raced. Whoever takes her home will get 20 years of the finest companionship you could ask for." His words were generous, selfless even, but they made the situation worse rather than better. Everyone could see how much it cost him to speak of giving her up, could hear the love and pride in his voice when he talked about her qualities. How much does he owe? The question came from Millicent Hayes, who'd been silent throughout the drama, but had been calculating furiously in her head. Hollis looked confused. "Ma'am?" "The debt. How much does Quentin owe the bank that they had to take his horses?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It wasn't anyone's business, really, but the extraordinary circumstances seemed to have suspended normal social boundaries. Quentin's face flushed red. "That ain't nobody's concern but mine, Mrs. Hayes. I appreciate the thought, but 47,000, said a quiet voice from the side door. Everyone turned to see Fletcher Morrison, the bank president, who'd apparently arrived during the commotion. He was a thin man with kind eyes who'd clearly taken no pleasure in foreclosing on Quentin's property. "The total debt is 47,000, including penalties and fees," Fletcher continued, looking uncomfortable but determined to speak the truth. "Quentin's been making partial payments when he can, but the interest keeps adding up." The number settled over the crowd like a lead blanket. $47,000 was more money than most of the farmers present saw in 2 good years. It might as well have been 47 million. But then something remarkable began to happen. Cordelia Vance stood up slowly, her designer purse clutched in her manicured hands. "I came here to spend 8,000 on that mare," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was contemplating. "But watching this, I don't think I could live with myself if I took her away from where she belongs." She paused, looking around the room at faces both familiar and strange, all united in their witnessing of something extraordinary. "I'll contribute my 8,000 toward his debt," she announced, her words causing a ripple of surprised murmurs throughout the crowd. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to the competitive nature of auctions, that it took several moments for people to fully comprehend what she'd offered. Cordelia's declaration seemed to break a dam somewhere in the collective consciousness of the crowd. For a moment, no one moved or spoke, as if the possibility of such generosity needed time to settle into reality. Then Boone McAllister stood up, his arthritic joints creaking audibly in the silence. "I reckon I can spare 3,000, he said gruffly, as if embarrassed by his own kindness. "Was gonna spend it on a horse anyway, and seems to me this old boy needs it more than I do." The wave of generosity that followed defied everything anyone present understood about human nature. Jasper Thornfield, who'd driven his cattle through 3 counties in a blizzard rather than pay for hay delivery, pulled out his checkbook. "Put me down for 2,000. Young Dr. Rowan Fitzgerald stepped forward from the back of the room. "I've got 1,500 in my truck fund," she said with a smile that transformed her serious face. "Guess I'll be driving my old pickup a while longer." One by one they stood. Farmers who counted every penny, ranchers who'd driven used trucks for 20 years, even teenagers who emptied their savings accounts earned from summer jobs. The amounts varied wildly. Some could offer thousands. Others contributed $20 bills worn soft from years in work pants pockets. But every contribution carried the same weight of shared humanity. Hollis abandoned all pretense of maintaining auction protocol and began keeping a running tally on the back of his catalog. 31,200, he called out as Morton Keller added his 500 to the growing total. "We're getting closer, folks." Belle seemed to understand that something important was happening around her. She stood quietly beside Quentin, occasionally nudging him gently with her nose as if to remind him that she was still there, still his, despite everything that had tried to come between them. Fletcher Morrison watched the proceedings with growing amazement and not a little professional discomfort. In 30 years of banking, he'd never witnessed anything remotely like this collective response to individual crisis. His training told him to be skeptical. Such displays of community generosity were usually more show than substance, but the checks and cash being pressed into Hollis's hands were undeniably real. 38,700, Hollis announced, his voice growing stronger with each tally. The crowd was getting close, closer than anyone had dared hope when this spontaneous fundraising began. But as the contributions continued, it became clear they were going to fall short. The final few donors were digging deep into pockets already emptied by previous generosity, coming up with a handful of crumpled bills and loose change. Every dollar mattered, but the mathematics were becoming unavoidably clear. $42,137, Hollis announced finally, his voice trailing off as he realized that was likely the end. People were looking around hopefully, but the well had run dry. The silence that followed was different from the earlier. Hush. This one carried the weight of noble failure, of hearts willing but resources insufficient. They'd come so close, had performed such an extraordinary act of collective kindness, but 47,000 had simply been too much for a room full of people who lived paycheck to paycheck. Quentin felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Though he couldn't say whether they came from gratitude for the unprecedented generosity or grief that it hadn't been quite enough. He looked around the room at faces he'd known for decades, at strangers who'd opened their hearts to his pain, and felt overwhelmed by the goodness of ordinary people. "Folks," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't have words for what you've done here today. Even if we can't make up the difference, you've given me something more valuable than money. You've shown me that Belle and I aren't facing this alone." But Fletcher Morrison was studying his calculator with a furrowed brow, working through numbers that didn't quite add up the way banking usually demanded. Finally, he looked up with an expression that mixed professional responsibility with human decency. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose the bank could consider accepting 42,000 as payment in full, given the unusual circumstances." The words hung in the air for a heartbeat before their meaning fully registered. Then the auction house erupted in cheers, applause, and not a few tears from people who'd never expected to witness such an extraordinary display of community solidarity. Belle, startled by the sudden noise, pressed closer to Quentin, who wrapped his arms around her neck and held on as if she might disappear again. Fletcher Morrison found himself surrounded by grateful handshakes and backslaps, though he tried to maintain his professional dignity. "The board will want documentation," he said weakly, but his protest was lost in the celebration swirling around him. "I'll handle the paperwork," Dr. Rowan Fitzgerald offered, appearing at his elbow with the confident smile of someone accustomed to cutting through bureaucratic red tape. "Pro bono, of course." Hollis had abandoned his auctioneer's podium entirely and was making his way through the crowd with a metal cash box, collecting the promised contributions with the solemnity of a church usher. Each transaction was accompanied by handshakes, backslaps, and the kind of emotional conversation usually reserved for weddings and funerals. "This is the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Boone McAllister muttered to anyone who'd listen, though his gruff tone couldn't hide the satisfaction in his eyes. 40 years I've been coming to these auctions, and I ain't never seen anything like it." Cordelia Vance had pulled her daughter Paisley aside and was explaining with tears in her eyes why sometimes the most expensive purchase was the one you chose not to make. "Remember this day," she told her daughter. "Remember that money only has value when you use it for something that matters." As the crowd gradually began to disperse, each person carrying away their own version of the story they'd just lived through, Quentin remained where he'd stood throughout the ordeal, one hand resting on Belle's neck, still unable to fully believe what had transpired. "We should probably get you home," he whispered to the mare, who responded by gently bumping his shoulder with her nose, a gesture so familiar and affectionate that it brought fresh tears to his eyes. The logistics of departure proved unexpectedly complicated. Quentin had walked 12 miles to reach the auction house, a journey feasible for a desperate man, but impossible for a man with a horse. But even this problem found its solution in the lingering spirit of generosity. Jasper Thornfield offered. His trailer, Boone McAllister, volunteered his truck, and within an hour, Belle was loaded and ready for the journey back to what remained of Quentin's property. As the convoy prepared to depart, Fletcher Morrison approached Quentin with an envelope containing the deed transfer papers. "There's one condition," he said, quietly, away from the still celebrating crowd. "The bank will need to see you back on your feet within the year. No more missed payments, no more falling behind." Quentin nodded solemnly, understanding that this second chance came with responsibilities. "I won't let you down, Fletcher. I won't let any of them down." The drive back to Quentin's property was surreal. Belle calm in the trailer, the landscape, familiar but somehow transformed by the day's events. When they finally arrived at the modest farm that had nearly been lost, Quentin led Belle into the small pasture behind his house and removed her halter. She immediately began to graze as if the trauma of potential separation had never occurred. But every few minutes she'd lift her head to check that Quentin was still there, still within reach. He sat on the porch steps, watching her, and marveling at the chain of events that had brought them both home. As the sun set over the fields, that would remain his after all, Quentin reflected on the extraordinary kindness of ordinary people. Tomorrow would bring the hard work of rebuilding, of proving worthy of the community's faith. But tonight, he was content to watch his horse graze in the fading light, surrounded by the sound of crickets and the solid reality of second chances. The story would be told and retold throughout the county for years to come, growing with each telling but never losing its essential truth, that sometimes, when hearts open collectively, the impossible becomes inevitable. And every time Belle lifted her head at the sound of Quentin's voice, she proved that some bonds run deeper than ownership. They reach into the very essence of what makes life worth living.